I think it's pretty apparent just from watching Trump, from his slushy speech, the way he kind of garbles his words, the way he kind of drifts and gets lost and he wanders into unrelated topics and stuff like that. I think it's just very apparent that the office overwhelms him. The demands of the office, just overwhelm him. That he may, people are saying maybe he's got dementia. I mean, that's out of my league, but I mean, he certainly looks old and tired and lost.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report, your one-stop guide to everything Trump, everything foreign politics in the United States, and just everything going on with the White House. So today it's all really about what's happening at the World Economic Forum in Davos. There's been a lot that's been going on in yesterday and today, so we'll get all into that. So today my guest is Professor Robert Kelly from the Pusan National University in Seoul, better known as the BBC dad for anyone watching. So Bob, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thanks again for having me, Maddie.
We have to talk about kind of what's happened in the last few days. Trump arrived in Davos for the World Economic Forum yesterday. He went straight into this speech where he spoke about the US economy. He stood strong on his Greenland ambitions. He criticised NATO and EU policies. He spoke about tariffs and global trade. The list goes on. But then not long after his speech was over, and I guess after the first day that he arrived was over, he wrote on Truth Social that based upon a very productive meeting that I've had with the Secretary General of NATO, we have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and in fact the entire Arctic region. This solution is if consummated, will be a great one for the US and all NATO nations. Based upon this understanding, I will not be imposing the tariffs that were scheduled to go into effect on February 1st. So then today, Bob, telling reporters, he said that it's really being negotiated now, the details of it, but essentially it's total access. There's no end, there's no time limit. So run me through what you think this framework means and the fact that it does look as if Trump was backing down from his Greenland ambitions potentially, because he said these tariffs will no longer take effect on February 1st. But then in conjunction to that, Bob, Mark Rutte, he told Fox News that a framework hadn't been discussed. So it's hard to know what this is and if it's true.
Yeah, so that's very Trump, of course, right, to get way out ahead of his skis. This is something that you and I have talked about before, and I think the whole world really kind of knows Trump has a tendency to go off and say pretty big, sort of outlandish things on social media, and then his staff walks them back or whatever. I think a lot of that, particularly when it's routed through Truth Social, is designed for his core voters, his base, MAGA, if you will, right? And so, going onto Truth Social and exaggerating and talking up some deal that may or may not exist, that's really sort of grooming his base, if you will. That's sort of like getting out there and tending to those who care about him most. I think for the rest of us, I'm not really sure how seriously the rest of us take Truth Social. So I think that's what's going on there, right? I mean, Truth Social is really sort of Trump's way of talking directly to his core voters. I think the larger issue is what you get to is what you sort of referenced there in the question, right, which is that nobody actually knows what the deal is and how different is it from what the United States has had with Greenland since the beginning of the Cold War, right? Again, I think everybody sort of knows at this point that the U.S. has a treaty with Denmark going back to the beginning of the Cold War, back to the late 40s, early 50s, which says that basically the U.S. can put whatever it needs there. And that was all pretty well understood. I mean, back when I was coming up through graduate school and we talked about transatlantic relations, this was never an issue. It was just kind of understood that the U.S. and Greenland worked together on U.S. and Denmark worked together on Greenland security, and the U.S. had bases there. And the fact the U.S. used to have a lot more bases, today it only has one. And it's just not clear if this framework agreement or the framework of a plan of an agreement or whatever this is, it's not sure how this really changes it, the extant structure. I mean, I've seen some stuff on Twitter and out there sort of floating around saying, well, the U.S. is going to have little enclaves of sovereignty in Greenland. I'm not really sure what that means. I would also point out that the Danish have been saying in the last few hours that that NATO doesn't have the right to negotiate Greenlandic sovereignty with the United States. That's solely for Denmark. So it's not really clear to me what Secretary General Rutte is actually allowed to argue or debate with Trump on this, right? I mean, the final word will come from the Danes and from the Americans if there's any kind of a deal. And so far, there's been no sort of formal language. And this is very Trumpian, right? He sort of strikes these deals and he sort of sees them as very interpersonal, and he sat down with somebody and he had a good talk with them, he shook their hand or whatever, but that's not an agreement, right? I mean, that's not legal, it's not black letter law, it hasn't been ratified. So until Trump actually has something in print over some signatures, it's just, we just don't know what this is. So my own sense is that this is kind of a lot of storm and stress that means nothing in the end, and that we're going to more or less have the relationship we've had with Denmark since the 50s, which is the United States can pretty much put in whatever militarily it wants. U.S. industry can go and invest there if it wishes. I don't see anything, and I'm not sure anybody else has seen anything that really changes the framework that's been there for 80 years.
Because there was that question of why Donald Trump wouldn't just turn to Denmark and say, "Hey, we want a little bit more presence militarily in Greenland in the face of what's happening in the Arctic. Are we able to create a new base?" And many analysts say that would have gone down well. They would have said, "Of course, put more in, no problem." But I wonder, Bob, if you think that Trump was met with strength and unification and intimidation by the EU leaders and NATO countries in attendance at Davos. We know that they were preparing for his big speech, preparing for his arrival in what had been a tumultuous few weeks with these Greenland ambitions, potentially an invasion. We weren't sure. There was a speculation that several senior US militants would resign if they were told that they had to invade. But we know that, of course, Trump, as you and I have discussed at great lengths, has the nickname Taco, and he's now said, come February 1st, that we won't be implementing these threats of tariffs on these EU countries. So, do you think that this is him backing down from these threats, and is he really, playing into this Taco nickname again?
Yeah, I think what probably really chastened him in the run up to the speech at Davos was the sharp market drop just a couple days ago, right? I mean, most of the major indices dropped something like 1.5% to 2% the day before the speech. The day after he announced that there would be tariffs again, a tariff conflict again with Europe. And the one good indicator Trump has of economic performance in the United States is the stock market. On unemployment, prices, inflation, Trump's record is sort of so-so, right? We're not talking about the affordability crisis. This is kind of something that people are talking about in the United States now. Inflation hasn't really come down. Gas prices are still sort of okay. Trump has not been this great sort of economic manager. It's okay, right? I mean, the catastrophe people expected last summer from the tariffs hasn't emerged. So Trump, I think, got lucky on that. But the one thing that Trump really can point to is the stock market, which I believe was up 15% last year. And previous to the Davos speech was actually up again this year. And then all of a sudden that just disappeared on, I believe it was Tuesday, right? And I think that spooked him because, Trump, he's a New York guy, he's a New York real estate guy, right? Trump is very sort of keyed into the stock market as a marker of his success, and all of a sudden it really slipped. And I think that probably added ammunition to his critics in the United States, presumably people like the Secretary of the Treasury saying, slow down on this because we don't know where it's going to lead. And so I think that was sort of on the domestic end in the U.S. And then on the foreign end in Europe, you had a unified wall of European resistance, which is something that Trump hasn't really encountered before, right? I mean, in 2025, I mean, you and I have talked about this, the Europeans spent a year sort of dancing around with Trump and trying to sort of massage his ego and convince him to get into Ukraine and this and that and everything else, right? And they come and they would sort of placate him. They'll all fly to Washington and meet him and stuff. And it looks like those days are over, that the Europeans are learning what I think others are learning in the United States too, which is that the way you deal with Trump is to resist. That if you bend, Trump just keeps asking and asking and asking, right? In sort of classic bully kind of format. And so, yeah, I think the Europeans probably learned a very valuable lesson.
It did really feel like the tide had turned in that way, Bob, because, before Trump had even arrived, of course, Air Force One was delayed by a few hours. But even, the day before, there was various speeches that were really trying to show strength and unification between these EU countries in anticipation for his arrival. But I want to get into a specific clip that's kind of made the rounds, and we'll show it to the audience. In Trump's speech on Wednesday, he appeared to mix up Greenland and Iceland. So I'm going to play the clip for you right now.
I don't know that they'd be there for us. They're not there for us on Iceland, that I can tell you. I mean, our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland. So Iceland's already cost us a lot of money. But that dip is peanuts compared to what it's gone up.
So, Bob, after that, Caroline Leavitt, Trump's press secretary, she responded to a Twitter user that said there seemed to be a mix-up. She claimed that it wasn't a mistake. She wrote on Twitter that his written remarks referred to Greenland as a piece of ice because that's what it was. So, I mean, I don't know if that was a very serious attempt at gaslighting the Americans, that he really didn't make this mistake. But what was your reaction when you saw that?
Yeah, I the same, I think, as almost everybody else outside of the MAGA bubble, which is that the president is too old to be president. I mean, I don't like saying that. I'm not a psychiatrist or anything like that, but I mean, he's 79. I mean, all of us have got aging parents, right? All of us have seen what happens when people get older and they mix things up, and people get confused and they get slow, and the engines just aren't firing on all cylinders like they were when you were were younger, and I think it's pretty apparent just from watching Trump, from his slushy speech, the way he kind of garbles his words, the way he kind of drifts and gets lost, and he wanders into unrelated topics and stuff like that. I think it's just very apparent that the office overwhelms him. The demands of the office, just overwhelm him. That he may, people are saying maybe he's got dementia. I mean, that's out of my league, but I mean, he certainly looks old and tired and lost. And this critique would be less biting if it weren't for the fact that this is what pushed Joe Biden out of the presidential election 2 years ago. But now that we've sort of established, at least in U.S. politics, the idea that, if you're kind of lost and confused at the podium, you shouldn't be president, then I think by that standard, Trump probably shouldn't be president. And I think this is what Levitt was really, really concerned about, right? I mean, the more Trump puts on these performances where he looks like he's lost and confused and unhinged and saying crazy stuff, I mean, the more you get the sense that he shouldn't be president, that the job is just beyond him.
And I'm not going to speculate if he's well or not, but you're right, Bob, in the sense that what happened with Joe Biden and this cover-up, because it very much was a big cover-up from the Democrats and the White House, is that it really did set this standard for the American people, that they thought, we're not going to make this mistake again. I know that, when Nikki Haley was running, she was running with the promise that she would make any politician who wanted to have a seat in Congress or the Senate, that they'd have to take a cognitive test if they were over the age of 75, which was, actually met with bipartisan support. People were saying, let's not make this mistake again. I'm not saying that Trump's, got any issues. I'm not saying that he's got dementia like others would say, but it's just an interesting point, and it's something that even if Trump was completely fine, he was always going to be looked at a little differently because he is in his late 70s, as you said, and he'll attempt to prove everyone wrong, such as his personality will, that's just part and parcel with who he is. But Bob, on a separate note, there was concern that Greenland would overshadow Ukraine at Davos, but various European leaders have been motivated to keep on track. So I want to play this clip from Finnish President Alexander Stubb. This is what he said this morning on stage.
Look, what has Russia achieved in the past 4 years? It's acquired 20% of the territory of Ukraine through military warfare, roughly 2%. In the process of doing that, it has provided about 1 million casualties and dead. It has decreased its sphere of influence. You can see the Central Asian countries, you can see the Southern Caucasus detaching themselves from the Russian Empire. You look at the Russian economy right now. If we go with the inflation rates of the 2 first weeks, we're looking at 30% inflation this year, 16% interest rates, zero growth, no more reserves, incapacity to pay the soldiers when the war ends. So I'm more worried about Russia's unwillingness to end this war because they cannot afford to do so than about Russia's capability to win this war because not end this war because they're moving ahead. So let's keep things into perspective. NATO hasn't entered the scene yet, and they have not been able to advance in the past 4 years as much as expected. This war has been an utter strategic failure of President Putin. He increased the size of NATO. He made Ukraine European. He increased the defense budgets of European states. And here we are asking ourselves, shaking, are we able to defend ourselves? My answer is yes, we are.
So, Bob, those words, that the war has been an utter strategic failure for President Putin. And here we are asking ourselves, shaking, are we able to defend ourselves? The answer is yes, we are. That speech, along with Mark Carney's speech, obviously that was not about Ukraine and Russia, but this one from Alexander Stubb really got to the core of the central issue here, which should be the Russia-Ukraine war and ending it. So what was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you got back to the core issue of transatlantic security, which is not sort of who is going to run this block of ice, right? But Ukraine, right? I mean, it's important to point out that Greenland is actually, it's important, but it's not very many people live there. It's very difficult to get to the rare earths. There's little evidence of direct Chinese and Russian sort of meddling in the region, and the U.S. has had a presence there going back to the 1950s, actually before that even. So, right, Trump kind of created this issue sort of ex nihilo, right? The real issue is, as you and I have discussed many times in this show, is how do we deal with Putin and his threat to Western security? And I actually agree that, yes, Europe can, in fact, do this, that this has, in fact, become a big strategic quagmire for the Russians. This is something like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, or the American wars in Vietnam or Iraq, which is say it's a quagmire where a big, large, modern, mechanized military gets sort of bogged down in an unwinnable conflict and doesn't know how to get out and becomes a huge drain on national power. So that, yeah, I mean, the Russians may win in the sense that they may slice off 25% of Ukraine and walk away with that actual territory, but the territory is devastated. Russia's economy is a mess. Inflation is high. It's burned through all of its military stockpiles, or a lot of them at least. And so in that sense, I think if the Europeans sort of step up and spend more on defense and build a better integrated military command, which is something that's been discussed for a long, long time, right? Trump's kind of pushing the Europeans towards that. Then I think, yes, I think European security comes out of this, out of the conflict advanced, or at least improved against the Russians, right? I mean, this war is supposed to end in 3 days for Putin, right? He thought this was going to be Crimea all over again, be some blitzkrieg. He'd slide in there, he'd take half the country, bully the rest of it, sort of convince the Europeans to sort of back off and negotiate with Putin as an equal, and that didn't happen. And now, Putin is very dependent on China for support. It's isolated in the world, right? And can't defeat the sort of like minor third part era sort of middle power on its doorstep, right? And if the Russians can't defeat Ukraine, then the rest of us shouldn't really be that worried, bar Russia's nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. And then on that note, Bob, Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, he spoke this morning at Davos where he said that he was off to Moscow to end this thing and that we're at the end of the negotiating process. He said that he's incredibly optimistic, but here are a few quotes that I thought were interesting takeaways. He says, I think we've got this down to one issue and we have discussed iterations of that issue and that means it's solvable. He also says, if both sides want to solve this, we're going to get it solved. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on this tactic from the US side to continue sending Steve Witkoff to Moscow? Of course, one takeaway that I've always believed is that anything is better than nothing, and that we've had more progress, even just keeping the conversation alive under the Trump administration. But this one issue that he's referring to is, of course, land concessions. And Russia won't budge on this, and Ukraine shouldn't. And then he's also saying that if both sides want to solve this, then we can. But Ukraine does want to solve this, and Russia doesn't. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, until Putin softens or changes his war goals, I don't know how a peace deal is possible. I mean, I've argued before in your show, and I get some criticism for this, but I've argued before that a passable end to this thing, if it could be guaranteed, would be that the Ukrainians give up what they have lost, and in return for that, they get entrance into NATO or the European Union, and they get really robust, solid security guarantees. That's not a great outcome because it does reward Putin's aggression, but a lot of people don't think Ukraine can get those territories back. And if the rest of Ukraine could get really permanent, solid security guarantees and could join the European family, I would argue that that's actually a passable compromise that Ukraine should be able to live with. But, I'm not Ukrainian, but whatever. Anyway, I've always thought the problem is that Trump cannot, I think that's kind of what Witkoff is actually kind of hoping might happen. The problem is that Trump can't guarantee that right now, right? I mean, Trump cannot guarantee that Ukraine will not be reinvaded or something like that. So the Ukrainians just aren't going to make these kind of concessions. They're not going to open themselves up, right? And until Putin says, until Putin backs away and sort of changes his war goals, has sort of less expansive goals, which I believe still include driving on Kiev, right? I mean, Putin and Lavrov still talk like it's February 2022. And so my sense is that we're not actually closer to a conflict. And I agree that it's good that they're still talking, right? I mean, my primary area is sort of like Korea, where the North Koreans often don't talk to us at all, and we don't know what the hell they're doing. So at least the Ukrainians and the Russians are talking. I mean, they're like, at least we're going to prevent like nuclear escalation or horizontal escalation. That's a good thing, right? We don't want the rest of NATO getting involved. So that's all good. But, Trump is an unreliable narrator. He's an unreliable guarantor at this point for any kind of deal that's been struck. And, Vladimir Putin, as best we can tell, still wants something that looks like victory of February 2022, something, like at least half the country, it seems like. He certainly doesn't seem to be willing to accept just what he's taken in exchange for ending the conflict, which I think is probably the best way to get to an end, or the easiest. So, yeah, so my own sense is no, actually, we're not actually close to conflict. I think this thing is going to grind on and on and on. Probably the way this thing might end, sorry, I don't mean to go on at length here, is that the Chinese pull the plug. As long as the Chinese are paying Russia's bills and providing with all kinds of assistance, right, then the Russians can keep grinding on because they're getting all this informal support through the back door from the Chinese. And ultimately what we need to do is convince the Chinese to stop supporting the Russians and sort of pull the plug. By the way, this is a problem we have with North Korea, too. One of the reasons why the North Koreans can go off and act really badly is because the Chinese are kind of behind them, letting them trade and do all kinds of illicit stuff like that, right? So if you kind of pull the plug on that external support, it becomes harder for the bad actor to continue.
Bob, we talk about this concession of Ukraine. Perhaps they give up Donetsk, which is of course around nearly 20% of their land occupied by Russian forces, in exchange for this security guarantee. Whether that's a NATO membership, whether that's being in the EU, or whether that's just a signed commitment, even through Congress, for US security. But if you're Zelensky, wouldn't you look at that and think we've been down this path before
Right.
in '94 when they signed over their nuclear powers,
Right.
and they haven't had the protection that they were guaranteed.
Right. Which is why I think it's pretty unlikely. I mean, the suggestion I'm throwing out there is somewhat similar to ideas that have been floating around for a while. But again, I mean, it requires that the U.S. and Europe, by the way, be willing to actually fight on Ukraine's behalf if the Russians cheat on the deal. And everybody thinks the Russians are going to cheat on the deal, which is why Zelensky doesn't want to give up the entrenched and well-defended territory that the Russians haven't yet taken. Right? I mean, the Russians want stuff they haven't won on the battlefield, and the Ukrainians are loath to give that up, in part because a lot of their defenses are there. Right? Think like the Sudetenland back in 1938. And that's really the concern, right? I still do believe that if rumps of Ukrainian security could be thoroughly and thickly guaranteed by NATO, including troops on the ground, that's the easiest way to get to the end of this thing. If that's not possible, which it doesn't look like it is, and the two players just continue to fight, I mean, this thing could go on for another 4 or 5 years.
Let's move on to the fact that Donald Trump and President Zelensky, they have met today for an hour to discuss this plan to end the war in Davos, while Trump's meeting with Putin is scheduled for tomorrow. So we saw Donald Trump this week invite both Vladimir Putin and Lukashenko to join his peace board this week. I think it was Board of Peace, prompting Zelensky to pretty much insinuate that he would be declining his invitation from Trump. When you see Putin handing out Trump handing out these two invitations to Russia and Belarus to join a board of peace, which currently is potentially meant to be about the reconstruction of Gaza, but he said that he's got wider plans as well. Does it feel as if Trump isn't really taking it seriously enough, the war in Ukraine, if he's able to send out these three invitations when you've got two opposing parties?
Sure, but yes, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, the Board of Peace is supposed to be about Gaza reconstruction, but I mean, the Israelis and the Palestinians are still fighting at this moment in Gaza. I mean, I feel like we're putting the cart ahead of the horse here, right? It also increasingly looks like the Board of Peace has sort of larger ambitions and might be some kind of like rival to the United Nations or something like that, right? A lot of liberal democracies in the world are not going to go along with that. You know, the Europeans, Japanese are not going to go along with some kind of like para-UN that is dominated by Trump and has like an admission fee, right? I mean, apparently Trump is asking for $1 billion in cash or some kind of like direct subsidy to like the Trump family to join this thing. I mean, honestly, it looks like another Trump scheme. You know, it looks like Trump University or Trump Steaks or Trump Airlines or something like that. You know, Trump puts his name on stuff and then, you know, we all pay him and nobody quite knows what they're getting for that money. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like another kind of like harebrained scheme from the Trump people designed to sort of gin up, you know, money like Trump coin or something like that. So, and I think
but imagine asking Zelensky for this $1 billion entry fee when, you know, he's just at the end of last year, he's just unveiled the target amount of money that Ukraine needs to be able to fight the war for the next 1 to 2 years. Money of which, you know, I think it said that they were going to run out of money by March or April, and they needed, you know, more money by then. So to ask for $1 billion entry fee along with Putin, who we know cannot afford that.
Right. It's a scheme. It's Trump University Part 2 or something.
Just finally, Bob, he did unveil this Board of Peace today in Davos, where he signed the founding charter along with several other countries. Some countries jumped on board with the opportunity while others were apprehensive. Trump said that he would work with the UN to ensure peace in the Middle East, but the details on the peace board does seem to be quite scarce right now. But what do you make of this? Do you think it will get Western allies signing it, or do you think it might kind of die down?
Well, from what I saw of the list today, it was a lot of sort of like minor countries, many of which are sort of interested in appeasing the Trump administration or sort of appealing to Trump's sort of pecuniary interest because of some issue or whatever. They want U.S. involvement in their local area, something like that. I didn't see any big European players I didn't see any major Asian players, for example. I didn't see, China, South Korea, Japan, any of those countries like that, right? So, I mean, I guess maybe as sort of like a starter effort, I guess it's okay. But again, I mean, it looks an awful lot like a lot of these other Trump initiatives, kind of like this thing on Greenland, right? It's sort of like a lot of big talk, and then the details aren't there at all anymore, right? I mean, what exactly is the plan for calming down Gaza? Is the really military going to withdraw? Are we going to like arrest everybody in Hamas? Who's going to reconstruct the place? Who's going to build the schools? Who's going to build the hospitals? Right? Are they going to have any kind of independence or sovereignty over the airspace or sea space off the coast? I mean, all these sort of big questions, right? All that is far more important, I would argue, than sort of like some kind of big UN, para-UN kind of framework, right? I mean, the whole point is to like bring peace to Gaza so that it's not constantly churning up these conflicts that the Israelis and Palestinians have been involved in now. I mean, I believe the Israelis have attacked Gaza 6 times in the last 20 years, something like that. I mean, that's what it really needs to do, and Trump has got to do that. And Trump's just not a detail guy. So again, we got all these sort of like big frameworks and initiatives and whatever, and then the details are really thin. And my guess is in 6 months, you and I won't be talking about the border peace because it'll just kind of slid away as another one of these things, like Infrastructure Week. It just kind of fades away as bluster, and I don't know. I mean, it just looks like another Trumpian kind of gimmick. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know.
Well, we'll be waiting to see if anything else comes out of the World Economic Forum. Professor Robert Kelly, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thanks for having me, Maddie.